Hey, I'm Ryan. I'm one of the co-founders and the CTO of Infer. Infer, in short, is essentially a data science platform for RevOps teams and analytics teams. I can give a little bit of background on myself, maybe. We started Infer 2 years ago, so we're a startup, we're new. And before that, I was a data scientist for about 6 years. And before that, I did a PhD in astrophysics. A alien chat. Any alien questions, let me know. Very quick, brief history of why we started Infer and why we're talking about fact-checking machine learning forecast models today. The idea was that we wanted to essentially bring the idea of like shift left to machine learning and data science. Shift left essentially means like bringing processes closer to those who are actually interested in using them, bringing machine learning to RevOps, bringing it to analytics teams, that sort of thing. That's probably enough from me. Who wants to go next? Freddie, do you want to
I can,
give
yeah.
it
So I'm Freddie. I'm the Senior Director of RevOps at Pinpoint. So we're a B2B SaaS company in the ATS space, which is like hiring, recruitment, that sort of stuff. It's all kind of handles. So I've worked in a number of different kind of go-to-market ops type and growth roles in tech companies over the last 7 years or so. Kind of starting out in marketing operations, very heavy on the data and analytics side there, which I think is where I got my love for a lot of this stuff. And then growing into kind of more kind of comprehensive revenue operations roles in the last few years, which to me felt like quite a natural progression. And I mentioned leading kind of growth functions in there too. I see the two as quite closely related at times. But yeah, good to be on this. As will probably be clear in this session, I do absolutely love working with data and very much heavy on the kind of SQL side. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, my name's Jeff Ignacio. Big part of the big fan of the RevOps community and all things SQL. Currently running a RevOps content business called RevOps Impact. So there's a podcast called the RevOps Review and a newsletter called the RevOps Impact newsletter. Started out in finance FP&A at Google, and obviously there is a bit of a self-serve culture, so taught myself everything SQL and BigQuery and Tableau for data visualizations. And then the last 10 years I've been in VC-backed high growth startups in a RevOps leadership position, commanding and leading that triple double journey for many companies.
Excellent. Thanks for introducing yourselves. I'll just go over the sort of agenda. This is a TLDR of what we're going to talk about today, which is essentially when machine learning appropriate for doing forecasting, but also for any kind of machine learning application, not just forecasting. The idea of how do you actually get your data into shape for doing more complicated machine learning, but also just in general how you should be treating your data in RevOps. Then moving on to how we bring about trust, really. So I would talk about pressure testing and fact-checking models, but really what I mean is building trust with your users of the models. And then eventually we'll move into more specific sort of use cases and where machine learning excels and where it doesn't excel quite as much. Three sort of first questions to get us started of when to use machine learning and when to not. My short answer, my soundbite for this is you're probably not ready to use machine learning if you can still hold all of your data in your head. So if you're a very new business, you've got a limited number of deals, or even if your just transaction volume is very low. So if you're doing like account-based marketing and you're targeting like one account a quarter or something, fair enough. Probably won't need to use machine learning. I think there's also an element of historical data. I think that you need to fail 100 times and maybe at least capture sort of 20 conversions before you want to get into using machine learning. I think there are probably some much longer answers on that, but that's my answer so far. I don't know if Freddie, Jeff, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd probably echo some of that. Certainly agree on if you have very little historical win-loss data to draw from, it's probably not right to be sitting an ML model on top of it. And I mean, there's no maybe right answer with that. I think you just need to be really careful drawing insight from pretty small data sets. I would say there's two other pieces that are quite important. I would say, particularly if we're talking on the sales forecasting side, kind of the new business piece, is that I do think you have to have the basics, or like the foundations of forecasting set up and the right buy-in and processes across sales leadership before we then go and apply this sort of model. It does depend on the product, but yeah, I think ML in the like sales context should be the thing that sort of amplifies and hones your forecasting, your existing forecasting process, not the thing that kind of establishes it and runs it. So yeah, I think you need to come at it from a point where you have some level of foundation here. And I think the other piece really in this is that if you're not really using a CRM right now, or at least your sales process isn't run reasonably consistently within that kind of platform, like your data doesn't need to necessarily be perfect, like far from it with this sort of thing. It can help you spot those gaps, but making sure that you've got that sales process reasonably well captured, that's just going to underpin like all forms of reliable forecasting, like regardless of any machine learning model on top of it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Also, is you use the word the perfect data, right? I think this is leading into the next point about the first question that we get, or at least the first comment, is I think people are often very almost embarrassed about their data. They're like convinced that it's always wrong in the worst in the worst way. And I think actually it's a little bit like a startup that it's okay. Everyone's embarrassed at the start, right? It's about the process, right? You there's no such thing as the perfect data set. There's always going to be issues. It's just about getting on that journey of fixing whatever's wrong. And how do you know what's wrong until you try to use it for something, right? So it's this, you don't wake up one day and you're like, I'm going to run the marathon. And then eventually it just happens. No, you start training, you start like looking into, you get the right gear and you start walking, running.
I'd say a couple things. One is, are you a good candidate? I worked for an AI startup or an AI customer service chatbot. And one of the things that we built into our qualification criteria for our sales development reps was the transaction volume, right? Or the volume that we needed to train the data sets on, if they were large and meaningful enough. If they were, too small, when we had thresholds, we would basically disqualify them. The second thing is at Google, I remember working with my data science team, and I remember my leader of data science would tell me that the majority of their time is not spent on building models. It was actually spent on cleaning the data, right? So you can be a data engineer, but you're in reality, much of the time you're a data janitor as well. So no surprise there. Even large organizations like Google are not in an amazing pristine state. And the third thing is you either buy or you build. And I've been in both environments, right? You can buy a solution, plug and play as much as possible, especially if it's a vertical base or a horizontal functional use case. You can't parameterize a model that fit for purpose. Or second, you can go build something out of a Jupyter notebook and start playing around and building something that's homebrew that can be meaningful. The flip side of that is how do you package and sell the outputs of what you're bringing to the table? Because I remember building a Monte Carlo simulation and talking how ceteris paribus, we would hold all variables flat while moving one variable. We would run thousands of trials. And I remember talking to my CRO and he just looked completely lost, right? So sometimes it's not about how you get there, it's about there and what that means for you. And then for those who are analytically minded and want to press into the details, that you come prepared to be able to answer what are those drill down questions that are below the surface. So just a couple of things in mind on my personal journey, applying techniques like machine learning.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of that idea of shift left that I mentioned earlier, which is sorry to mention and infer again. One of the things that we really wanted to do was bring that machine learning part to the people who are in the details, who know about the data and they care about the outcome, and they're much more focused on, they know what they need to present. And previously at some of the companies I worked at, there was very distinct line between who could do advanced machine learning and who was interested in the business outcome. And I think actually those worlds, if they can be merged, should be merged. It's just that no one knows the data best and is interested in the outcome as much as the business user. Yeah, and then hopefully that would circumvent that issue with trying to present things to the CRO when you're 2 or 3 levels away from that interaction normally. Excellent. Freddie, I think you had a point in this third card that you presented last time. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose if we're starting the sales forecasting piece to begin with, it'd be good to talk on the upsell side of this later on, predicting churn risks and all that sort of exciting stuff. But if we're sticking in that kind of sales and new business context, and this is a little bit on what I was talking about earlier in terms of having some of those basics of forecasting set up and that right buy-in and that process and that kind of baseline there. Like we need to be able to I think before we go and dig into this sort of data analysis, like we have to be able to get a good picture of, are we giving ourselves a good chance, or is it a good of a chance to hit the number this quarter? Are we creating enough opportunities to hit our number for next quarter? And are we able then to get into a nice analytical rhythm without a lot of this on top of it? And this is what I'm getting at a little bit earlier with, I really think these sorts of models, maybe not in every context, but in kind of the context I'm thinking in right now, is this should be amplifying this and helping us fine tune our forecasting accuracy, getting to a point where we're then able to identify those slightly riskier deals that we're pegging our forecast on for this quarter, like making sure that most likely forecast is as good as it can actually be. But this is it. This is it. I think it's like we need to actually really, as I say, establish that baseline and that foundation on the forecasting side before digging into this side of it. I think there's something to be gained from throwing our data at a model like this, but I think having your processes set up and a bit of a revenue cadence going for this is really important first. And I think even if you're just getting started, I still run a lot of my forecasting process from a Google Sheet. There's kind of exports weekly from the CRM. We look at kind of coverage and all this sort of stuff. There's some stage weighted stuff in there. We're bringing in the ML model now. But all of that is happening on a weekly basis with CROs, sales managers, and it's about creating a really strong dialogue from that data. And I think once we've got to that point, then we can start to apply these extra models that will help us to really fine tune and kind of hone our accuracy. But I think it's first about getting to that point where we're happy and we've got that buy-in with this process, before we really dig in on this side.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's essentially you really need to get your data in shape first. Yeah. And part of that is actually the process and getting buy-in and alignment. Okay, let's get into the data part of this. One thing I found with our customers, especially those who are on the earlier side of the journey, where this is maybe their sort of first foray into using machine learning in like pipeline optimization. So let's talk about lead scoring, for example. Lead scoring is like the classic like sales enablement machine learning pipeline. And it's all about taking all of your prospects and essentially giving them some kind of score so that you can rank them. And then you can like divvy up all the top prospects to your SDRs. And I think people starting this, I think there are two things. So one is previously there would be few reasons to get your data to be absolutely consistent and correct, right? The penalty for not having good data is low, right? The more and more you use your data for machine learning or even just for analytics, the more important it gets to have good processes. So actually, even just getting started, like I tell people, just get started. Even just that fact of getting started means that you have to think about your data quality. And now people actually behave differently after they start to implement these things. Because once you get started, it will bring up the issues. You know what the issues are. You then feed back to anyone who's updating your CRM or like any other system that you're using, and people behave differently. So even without turning the machine learning model on necessarily, people start to think about it, and they realize that this is now really important because there are downstream effects. If you've got garbage in, garbage out, you're not going to want to spend a lot of time on machine learning and building all these workflows off your machine learning predictions if the data is not being consistently updated. So yeah, that to me actually was the most insightful thing that happened once we started working with our customers, that their behavior changes internally. And that's something I hadn't expected.
Yeah, not too surprised to hear that, really. Like, even without a kind of machine learning angle to some of this, we're talking about in the context of RevOps now, really, aren't we? But one of the big missions of RevOps, as far as I'm concerned, is getting everybody bought into being data-led and making sure everybody knows what's going on and is on top of the things that contribute to our core objectives. But one of the things that's really helped us in that respect is we have a very much public, like internally public go-to-market model. So we run all of this in a tool called Runway right now, which is giving us this ability to share that model. Everybody sees what contributes to that model. And like, if I'm thinking in like the marketing context, like them actually having hands-on input into that model and seeing downstream impact of planning and all of this has just really changed the entire culture around data. And I see our kind of progression into using some of these machine learning models now as part of that. So it's really exciting to see some of this, but certainly in the internal RevOps function, like the way we're approaching things and the way we're approaching problems is exciting in this respect. But yeah, I see that.
So we have an interesting question I figured would pop up. So Ryan and I discussed this earlier. Do you have any resources around sample size and ability to deploy machine learning? And Ryan, I remember our conversation about strength of signal, but would love Jeff to follow on with stage of company and product market fit. So Ryan, if you could tackle the question first, I may pitch a different question to Jeff.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, so I guess the question is, do you have any resources around sample size and ability to deploy ML models? So this is such a common question that it's in our FAQ. It's a frequently asked question. Yeah, for sample size, it's an interesting question. You basically need to think about how strong the effect size is. And what I mean by that is sometimes if you've got 20 data points, you could have a really strong signal that is super obvious. And that would be like, you have a really completely well-defined like ICP, for example. And so your prospects have very well-defined characteristics, and therefore you only need a small sample size to have a good predictive model. On the flip side of that, you could have a very random ICP, or it also depends on the data quality itself. There are like lots of factors that like stretch what the sample size is. In practice, I think I usually say you really need at least a sample size of maybe 100 if you're going to do lead scoring. It also depends on like the sort of breadth of your data. The short answer is it depends. Yeah, but I guess Jeff, you'll have another perspective on this.
So where I've deployed machine learning is in a couple of places, and I've had varying degrees of success. One was at the lead scoring level at an enterprise B2B SaaS provider. That was not as successful because our lead volumes were, quite frankly, not very meaningful. I didn't perform the stats or the machine learning algorithms. I actually engaged with another staff member on our data science organization, and the word from him was, we just don't have a volume to draw meaningful conclusions. So instead, we changed it over to our existing customer base. The company had been around for 6-7 years already. And so there was quite a bit of history around product usage metrics. And so the machine learning model showed us a couple of things. Some of the core features or key usage indicators were actually quite predictive to renewal outcomes. And they were actually somewhat predictive for churn risk. So one churn risk was the champion user was not using our product stopped using it. You can see the time series drop in usage. And that was a harbinger that something was amiss with the account. The second one was number of active users on a monthly basis. And once we saw that there wasn't like what we call broad-based adoption, there was just a core concentrated set of users, but yet our product was meant to be broadly used across the entire org. That was also a strong signal to us that the account was at severe risk of. The number one complaint that we received was, we're just not getting enough value. We're just not getting enough value out of this. Even though you talk to the person who uses it, who logs in every day, and they'll tell you a totally different story. They'll tell you, we use this all the time, right? So this tale of two cities. Another area for success in SMB transactional selling motion, we received like roughly 150 leads per day. So we ran a cohort analysis on a trailing 90-day basis, and we found meaningful correlation with some of the factors that we weighted into our formulae. And so we used that to refine our lead score every other quarter. And what we ended up finding was, whenever our algorithm, our machine learning models started to deviate from our performance, it was because there was an emerging segment popping up in the leads which we didn't account for in our models.
Yeah, and if I could, as an analyst and marketer, a couple points, particularly in immature companies. I love working for early stage startups, but they don't always have target market fit figured out, even though they think they do. So they have very strong opinions about what their ICP is, but when you actually look at the data points, don't exist to analyze, or we're trying to be everything to everyone and don't have a very strong pattern to chase. So those are just two things I would watch for, particularly if you're in a smaller startup.
I've definitely had several occasions where some of the insights that we had would actually point to the opposite of what they thought their ICP was.
All the time.
Yeah. And it makes sense that maybe there's some kind of like saturation effect, or there was this early signal early on that just doesn't exist anymore. Things change. And I think that like dynamic element is really important to make sure that you're like retraining the models, that you're understanding like what is changing, and that's like being serviced. I think just talking about like the sample size and like effect and accuracy and things like that. I think what's really interesting is that the metrics that come out of machine learning models for this, they only matter somewhat. And what I mean by that is that, so for example, we had one of our customers had essentially acquired a big old list of leads of, like 100,000 plus leads. And obviously a person cannot, there's no way a person can rank these. And so we started looking into it, and actually after that ranking happened, even though the accuracy wasn't super high, the scale of the data meant that the outcome was super important, right? And so even though the correlations weren't like super duper strong, that didn't really matter because a person was never going to be able to accomplish that task. And then likewise, in the like downstream effects, the metrics that you look at are not accuracy exactly. Actually, you look at what's your like net retention rate. How does that impact the higher level business metrics? And so if your ranking is good enough and it's, I don't know, 50% better than if a person was picking it, then that's what really matters, not that your accuracy is 87% or whatever the machine learning model says it is.
Yeah, that makes it somewhat relativistic to the outcome you're looking for. Wait, that's super interesting. So if your R score is not super high, but yet it still outperforms, what you're actually doing. I love that. That makes a lot of sense.
Maybe we should talk about enrichment. I think it becomes more and more important as well as we move into discussing expansion, existing business, rather than the sort of new business forecasting. Freddie, I don't know if you could chat about that.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I suppose in terms of getting our data ready and getting our data in shape, enrichment is a big piece for a lot of revenue operations teams. And it's a bit of a hot topic right now in the SDR space and all sorts. Is like how we create a really nice, clean data set that's well enriched on our schedule. Maybe there's web scraping in there. Like, can we rely on certain data providers, ZoomInfo, Clearbit, all of these, or do we need multiple of them? But I think one of the things that and this is like a really important piece for us, is like having set up this like enrichment engine in the background. That means we have really reliable thermographic data on all of the companies in our system, both customers and kind of new business. And it is certainly really interesting if we're talking the upsell side, the customer side, but actually we're actually finding this is really interesting if we're talking about the lead scoring side as well. So one of the exercises we've been through recently is like really carefully mapped our kind of TAM, SAM, SOM in the CRM, tagged everybody up, and then using a bit of a combo of tools, but primarily using a tool called Clay, which again is very hot at the moment. And I think often for the wrong reasons around like sales outreach and things, but actually for data enrichment and creating an engine there, really cool, really powerful. But then because we have such a large data set there and we're enriching on in so many different areas, we're now starting to feed this into some different models. So that's a really important piece for us, and being able to rely on those firmographics, like the way we want to slice that data in our kind of ML model. And that's the piece that's quite big for us. We are now applying that to our customer base as well. So of course we have lots of lovely modeled aggregated product data to feed in. But also we want to make sure that the data we have against our customers, everything from the industry level at kind of very specific industry level, higher level groupings of that, what tool they were using prior to us, where they've got their employees located is important to us. All these sorts of different factors that are kind of quite hard to get at, but actually using some of this enrichment tooling is giving us a really strong data set now. So yeah, being quite intentional with all of this enrichment. It's not just throwing it at Clearbit or something like that. It's just in the way we're intentionally approaching what we're doing with machine learning now. It's being really intentional with how we're curating that data set so that we can split this up and by any dimension we like. Yeah, that's been quite a big piece for us over the last year, I would say, in setting up this engine, and it's starting to pay off, I think, in how we're kind of able to set up some of these models now.
I think modern companies can really rely on, there's so much data out there, right? There's so many tools that are usually disconnected. And I think that modern teams can really rely on the modern data stack to do all that heavy lifting. So like the classic thing people have now is like Fivetran or Airbyte or something for ETL. putting things into a centralized data warehouse so that you can pull together all of your different CRM data, your like all of your enrichment sort of third-party tools, like sales conversational tools like Jiminy or Gong, and also like your actual product data, product usage data, which will change depending on what your business is. I think that like standardization has really helped people get into those like very wide tables where you suddenly have a lot of information about your current users and current customers. And I think now that we're at that stage where that's like relatively well commoditized, it's about making sure that we use that data appropriately. Like how can we take all that lovely centralized data, and then the final step is essentially processing it somehow, either doing analytics or, as we're talking about here, machine learning. And you can do that sort of like on the data warehouse itself using SQL, or we have our own sort of SQL extension at Infer. And then the last part is using reverse ETL, because I think there's almost a disconnect between the people who can do that analysis at like advanced analytics, machine learning, and then the systems where they're used. It could be the CRM, but it could also be another tool that the CS team use. And so for me, it's really important to not just have everything in the centralized warehouse, but the whole purpose of the warehouse is to then start putting that centralized data back into the original systems. So you could use something like High Touch. We also have our own reverse ETL that's sort of specifically for machine learning. Yeah, I think actually, to me, the whole point of that modern data stack is the last step of reverse ETL into places where people are actually going to use things. I remember hearing another VP of sales saying that, at least at their company, like everything's in HubSpot. People just work in HubSpot. They don't want to go to BigQuery. They don't necessarily know SQL. They don't want to go into 10 other tools. They want things in one place. And I think, to me, that should be like our ultimate goal, right?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. And it's the path we've taken is that while we have this lovely unified data set living in our data warehouse, RevOps are really the only ones interacting with it at that level. Yes, we produce some more advanced dashboards in like Power BI and this sort of stuff. But really, like I think of it as like how we activate that data, how we actually package it up and make it useful to view in a CRM. That's really where you're gonna actually see value. For building like churn risk models and things, we see usage dropping. Like, what does that actually translate to? How are we going to push that to the CS rep who owns that account? That's the kind of level of this that we really start to see value from, I think. Like it's all amazing to look at analytics wise, and it's great to geek out over, but actually, like, how are we going to practically get this data in front of people and make it useful? And that's, I find, actually the most fun part of all of this is like, how can we actually get this data into the hands of people that are going to go and use it and deploy it at the ground level?
I think also in terms of automation, like once you start to pump out predictions, yes, it could go to a person if that's the right thing, but also that you can do like further automations downstream. So things like personalized emails or reminders, notifications, things like that, where you can actually affect user behavior directly from that like centralized process. I think the more automations you can build off of that, the more powerful it is. Your machine will work while you sleep, which is just like the dream, right? We can move to a 4-day week or then a 3-day week. But if you have thoughts about, Jeff, on operationalizing more centralized data.
I think the old adage is right, people, process, technology. And I think a lot of what you have here on the slides encompass this. It's easier said than done, and it doesn't happen overnight. And so one, you want to prepare your organization for the outcome and power of these models and what they can ultimately benefit you as an organization in terms of your decision making. How the sausage is made, there are some folks who care about it. There are some folks who don't. And there's some folks who think this is hard work in order to move us from here to there. So as a RevOps leader, I would communicate it at multiple levels. To the front line, we want to sell the benefit, mostly what's in it for me. You may also have to introduce carrots and sticks as incentives to get people in line. For the more technically aptitude folks within the organization, so your data engineering, folks in the revenue operations, I think they're going to love how the piping is set up. So those are things that I think brings joy to some of those folks in the operations side of the house. And then for leadership, I've never found a leader that said, wow, I'm really interested in the detail, but they're interested that this gives them a competitive edge, right, over their peers. And so that's something that we want to be very proud of. So like in the board meetings or in QBRs with the organizations, we talk about how we're developing capabilities in-house, and we don't need to tell folks the exact detail, but it implies machine learning, using our data, creating predictive models that will lead to better outcomes, more targeted markets, and more predictable forecasts. That's the type of stuff that I think you want to operate at different communication levels across the board. The hard work is obviously the people, processes, and technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and actually that sort of leads into part of this idea of like how can people trust it so you can get into that process. I think what we wanted to talk about here was about, are there any like specific things you can do to help build that trust? I have an article I wrote, it's just maybe posted already, but I think there are lots of ways to skin a cat and to present your findings. I think in particular I'm going to use lead scoring as an example here. We found with our customers that our approach has always been to not use a black box, to not hide away and dumb things down too much. So we always give them three things. The main thing that made a massive difference is that we always give the top reasons for a prediction. So we would use like explainable AI, where you can start to say the reason why this prediction was made, the reason why this person is predicted as a good prospect is because their job title is VP of Engineering and you're selling some cybersecurity SaaS software, which makes sense, right? And so once people start to see things that they already know to be true, then they start to trust it even more because it's that like sanity check. There were two or three other things actually. Two things that we provide as well is when we provide a number, we always try to provide the actual estimated probability that's calibrated to real life. So if on average you're closing 10% of your deals, then on average, the score that you're going to see is about 10%. Of course, you'll get things that might be up to like 30% or like as low as 1% if one's a really good prospect, one's not. And knowing that the number that is generated isn't arbitrarily made up. Things like, oh, your score is 87 out of 100. And you're like, cool, is that top 1%, top 10%? What's good? What's bad here? Like, is 63 bad or is that fine? And I think once that the intention is that you're trying to make it simpler, but actually it just obscures the original meaning of what the score is. I think that's really important for building trust. And then the last part is bringing in extra sanity checks. Overall, are these predictions, so not just on the micro level, but on the macro level, are these explaining the overall sort of trends and correlations that we've seen before, and bringing those things together, I think is that first hurdle that you need to get over to make sure that that they trust it and they will actually use it. Because if you fail at that first hurdle, people are not going to use it, and then the project's dead. And so I think it's really important to get the right elements in there to build trust early on, so that later people might not have to think about it as much and they just take it as fact. Yeah, I don't know if you had any trouble, Jeff, before with people not actually using the output or.
So it's just a couple of things, right? So whenever I had a point estimate, like just a flat number, I think a lot of folks, for some reason, trust a point estimate a heck of a lot more than if you provide ranges and distributions. When I think the ranges and distribution are actually much more descriptive of what could play out. So for example, if you were to play the quarter out 1,000 times, you probably wouldn't have the same result any one time in those 1,000 different quarters. But that's very hard to articulate. So instead, what I try to do is here are the set of scenarios that would lead us to the low side of the distribution. And here are the scenarios that would play out for us to go to the high side of the scenario. Does everything need to break right in order to achieve like a top 10% income? Or do we need like a modest set of outcomes in order for us to move the needle towards the top half of the range? So that's the type of conversation that I like to have with my marketing or my sales leaders, and giving them confidence, like, this is a tough quarter. The model suggests that it's going to be a tough quarter all around because all the parameters for us to achieve them are on the more difficult side of the house. Some quarters might be a little easier. We want to explain that, yes, I can provide a number, but what gives trust and confidence to my organization is that I'm able to articulate like why we might end up on the low or the high or the medium side of the distribution. And I liken the output to talking about sports. You have the best team on paper, but you never know throughout the season. Someone might get injured, someone might be out, a deal might fall through. Just a number of different factors might play out that do not allow you to achieve the higher outcome. But at the end of the day, as an org, we want to go in with the best hand possible. And these models should help us try to articulate that.
There's a question here on, do you have any resources in which ML models to use for lead scoring? I have a very standard answer, which is that you should use XGBoost, if anyone knows what that is, which is like the gold standard. There's also a few other ones that are very similar, like DB. But basically, there are some models in machine learning that are very, very well tested now. And as a baseline, it's super, super good. In terms of what that model actually is, it's essentially based around, it's really good for tabular data. It stands for extreme gradient boosting, yes, yeah, algorithm. And at its core, it's really a very fancy decision tree to really break it down. Of course, there's more elements than that, but that's more or less what it is. And it has these really amazing properties. One of the best things about it is that it can handle missing data natively. So one of the things you need to account for is that actually a lot of the time, most of your columns in your data set will probably have at least some missing data. And even the idea of missing data is also a type of data. So if something is missing, usually it's missing for a reason. So it's not missing at random. And so you should actually use that missing data in your prediction. So XGBoost is like amazing at incorporating that element. It's also really good at mixing together different data types. Things like you have like categorical data, but you also have like numerical data. And traditionally, that's actually quite hard to combine in machine learning. XGBoost very naturally takes that into account. It's really good for, how would I say this? It's scale invariant. What I mean by that is that, so some machine learning models, or statistical models at least, really care about what kind of units you use. And by units, let's say we're talking about predicting someone's height. So if you'd used inches instead of centimeters or meters, for some machine learning models, you actually might end up with quite different predictions just by changing the numbers that were used, and which doesn't really make any sense to a person, right? Height is height. Whatever you use to measure it doesn't matter. Before XGBoost, it doesn't care about what the scale is. It's robust to outliers. Anyway, I can talk about this all day. This could be like a separate webinar on XGBoost. So yeah, basically, internally, we only use XGBoost for all of this just because it's just so reliable. Don't know if anyone has any challenges on that. So there's a question on giving examples of customer inputs that you measure that drives the model for reducing churn in your existing customer base and identifying growth opportunities. Customer churn especially is very dependent on the business itself that you're running. For customer churn, you always need your product usage data. The traditional stuff in your CRM is good too, especially if you're using it with customer success. A really common thing that we use, actually, this is maybe unusual, is there's always a tremendous amount of text data. So if your customer success team is logging any conversations that they're having, we find that is there. You can essentially do a keyword analysis and match that to your renewal process, and you can match those sort of like keywords that appear, whether that's a good set of conversations or not. So those notes are really good as identifiers. And usually what happens for small businesses, people can have things all in their heads, and that's okay. At scale, that doesn't work anymore because you only have your small set of customers that you're successing with. And so you need those machine learning models that look at the bigger picture. So keywords, also like standard product usage metrics, so like recency, frequency, like monetary value. If there's any demographic information, is this more of a B2C business or a B2B? That also matters. I don't know if anyone else has any other things that I might have missed.
Yeah,
B2B.
yeah. Something kind of Jeff mentioned earlier, and this is honestly where I start most of the time when looking at product data to begin with. Is it does depend on the product, but starting to think about frequency of logins and looking at trends and certain power users dropping off, that sort of thing is often a really nice indicator, like reasonably early indicator of churn. Certainly something that we're doing more of now, which is really starting to improve our model here, is looking at particular feature adoption, which kind of matters for our product. Maybe not so much in this case, I'm not sure, but combining that login data with looking at what certain features are being adopted, percentage of the user base is using X thing in this particular organization, and starting to get a picture of what a good customer actually looks like. Because I think it can be really, like, every product is going to be quite different with this, and you might have different parts of your user base that are going to use the product in very different ways, like from different industries. Maybe they log in twice a month and that's okay, or once a year and that's okay. And maybe they're even the best customers. So like really getting into the context of what a good customer actually looks like at your business, I think is the key piece first, and then starting to think about logins as a good start, but then thinking about particular feature adoption and what actually you think those kind of features might impact is a really important one. Like on the upsell side, one of the things we can apply all of that to the upsell piece. I think it's easier to apply on the churn side, but the upsell side, one of the things that we've been looking at right now is just very simply like looking at customer base, people that we've already upsold to and that have been on a kind of pretty strong journey of expansion with us. What are the commonalities between those customers, and just starting to look at things like the firmographics, what industries, size of company, the types of kind of user we're working with. That sort of stuff has given us some really interesting stuff on the upsell side, like identifying customer segments that maybe we want to spend a bit more time with because similar customers have found a good path to upsell.
Yeah, I was actually going to make the same point there. The great thing about doing retention scoring or churn analysis or whatever you want to call it is that you essentially get upsell and cross-sell for free because it's basically the same data set, but you're trying to do you're trying to predict just one thing that's different. So doing that work means that you get 3x your returns on just that one model. Yeah, there's a great question on forecasting that I'm maybe intimidated to answer because it's a really hard one. I don't know if anyone wants to answer that first, or we could, I don't know if there's anything else that someone wants to add first before we maybe wrap up because we've just got a few minutes left.
Yeah, that is a tricky one.
Which question? The marketplace question?
Integrating forecasts. So there's 3 versions and they want to ensure everyone's point of view is taken into consideration. And I would pose a question back. Should they all be? Is this a democracy?
In Amazon, we had multiple forecasts. We had multiple variants of a machine learning forecast. We had a bottoms-up forecast, which was submitted by the sales organization with commentary. We took one forecast as gospel, but it doesn't mean that we did not acknowledge the other forecasts. We just wanted to give color and a narrative to each one of the forecasts. Historically, one forecast is always higher than the other. So whenever we see an intersection or an inversion of the forecast, it's something to definitely pay attention to. If the gap in the forecast in terms of percentage relative to one another also changes materially, it's also something to look at. And so what we try to do is try to describe what are the changes between the two forecasts and then the historical interaction between the two. But yeah, we try to nail one forecast, but the other forecast just helps us inform it. In my mind, it's almost like a marketing attribution model. You're not going to run with just a first touch, last touch, and then a multi-touch. You're going to look at it all. You're going to look at the same problems, the same set of data with different angles, and you're going to draw different conclusions from it. And somewhere in between is probably some veracity that you can apply towards your business.
All right. Thank you so much for everyone who's here. We are going to be sending out the deck resources, and there's always a recording posted on the RevOps Co-op under Learn and Video Library. So as you exit, please do take the survey. And thank you all so much for sharing your knowledge. I know I learned a lot. I hope other folks did too. And have a great day.
Thanks everyone.